Looking for something to read? Well, these are the books that I've written. Hop on down to the description to find the Amazon links for all 4 of them, and keep your eyes open for more in the future. With that said, on to the video. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Omni viewer, and since I reviewed the first season of Sonic Prime, I figure it's only prudent for me to continue and review the second season of Sonic Prime. Yes, I did just finish watching it. It was surprisingly easy to binge, and I decided I would just do the whole thing as opposed to going episode by episode. So just to get everyone caught up on the basic premise, the series began with the idea of Eggman going after this particular crystal. Sonic and his team go in to stop him, but Sonic accidentally collides with the crystal and breaks it, which turns out to actually break reality itself. When the crystal shatters, the bigger shards wind up forming these new realities where alternate versions of different Sonic characters exist, with the exception of Sonic himself, as well as Shadow the Hedgehog. And Sonic appears to be the only one who can travel between these realms basically at will, if he figures out how. Season 2 picks up where Season 1 left off, where Shadow basically fills Sonic in on exactly what happened and proposes that there is a possible way to fix things. The original reality still exists, but more as kind of a ghostly reflection of itself. There are certain static images, well, semi-static images of the original characters just sort of existing there. The whole setting has become very gray and lifeless, but the area where the crystal was is still there, and it's theorized that if all of the shards can be gathered and brought back, maybe things can be set right. And so Sonic is the one who has to go and collect all the shards. Shadow tries to do it by himself because, you know, that's what he does, but he, for some reason, cannot enter all of these other realities. Only Sonic can. And so, the quest is on to try getting all of the shards back together. Fortunately, Sonic has made some allies, but that doesn't necessarily mean his alliances are going to remain as steadfast as they were with his original crew. And at the same time, the Council of Eggmen from the cyberpunk New York City reality have harnessed some of the crystal energy themselves and are deciding to branch out into the Hedgehog-Verse and conquer all of reality itself. And as if that weren't enough, Shadow has also pointed out that there appears to be this area which is, for all intents and purposes, located down. I mean, it's in the void, so it's hard to say what direction anything is. But it's this big black area which, as far as anyone can tell, is just oblivion. He already lost a Chaos Emerald in there, and he hasn't seen anything come out yet. So the stakes have been raised. Overall, it's a good continuation of the story that was set up in Season 1. In fact, it makes a couple of improvements. One thing that kind of dragged Season 1 down at times was that there were very infrequent, yet still very obvious moments of cringy humor. I mean, they were infrequent, like I said. They didn't happen that often, but when they did, they really stood out because of how infrequent they were, and they lasted longer than they should have. Season 2 does not have any of those moments. There's still humor in there, of course, but it's not the sort of thing that makes you roll your eyes or think, man, I wish this was over. No, it actually feels more appropriate. It stems more from the characters and their situations than it does from somebody thinking that the audience will somehow laugh at this because they'll laugh at anything. So that's a major improvement. We also get to see characters from the different realities interacting with each other now. Rusty Rose, the robotic version of Amy Rose from the cyberpunk reality, winds up with the pirates. She was technically already there at the end of Season 1, but now we actually get to see her interacting with them, and in particular, how she interacts with her pirate version of her alternate self. Because, you know, there's going to be that sort of surreality of meeting yourself from another reality. We get moments of that throughout as well, as Captain Dread Knuckles winds up in New York and encounters the Rebel Knuckles, and During the finale, without giving too much away, Nine, the cyberpunk version of Tails, sees his alternate selves as they're trying to find some way back to the original world. That was the sort of thing I was hoping they would do in Season 2. You can't just throw in all these alternate versions of these characters and not somehow bring them together and see what happens when they are in the same setting. And while I don't necessarily think they've done as much as they can with it, yet anyway, what they have done works quite well, all things considered. Now, that being said, there are a couple of issues, most of which comes down to the action. Not that the action is poorly animated or that it's uninteresting, it's more that it just tends to get a little repetitive at times because the characters are facing the same kinds of opponents over and over again, just wave after wave of them constantly coming, and right when you think it's done and there's a chance to just sort of settle down and take a break, there's more of them. And I get that the idea that it's supposed to be that sort of relentless onslaught, but at the same time, like I said, same kind of enemies, the kind of enemies that we know they can defeat. And any new varieties that might show up are defeated relatively quickly, so they kind of lose their edge after that. It's kind of unfortunate, really, because when the fights in this show are good, they're really good. The most interesting ones are actually when the alternate versions of the Sonic crew wind up in one way or another turning on Sonic, which does happen. That's not too much of a spoiler there. But there are moments where certain characters will get it in their heads that Sonic might not actually be their ally. And so they turn on him briefly. And it's those fights that are more interesting because there's a bit more emotion behind those ones. After all, these are people Sonic cares about, people Sonic wants to help, but also they're starting to get in his way of saving his original crew of friends. Speaking of which, there's another interesting little thing this series introduces in this season, but I don't necessarily know if they explored it to the full extent as yet. Right in the first episode, Shadow and Sonic wind up having a tiny little bit of a disagreement about the nature of the Shadowverse. One that I honestly was thinking was going to be an issue at some point, but I'm glad they introduced it all the same, because you never can be sure if certain series are going to go in a particular route. The disagreement they have is whether or not the different people throughout the Shadowverse count as real. As far as Shadow is concerned, they're all just caricatures sprung off from the real people he knows, the real world he knows. That none of it is actually real, none of it really should have existed, and therefore his priority is just restoring the reality he knew. Sonic, on the other hand, has spent time in these alternate worlds. He's spent time with these alternate characters. He's built relationships with them. He knows them to a certain extent. And to him, they are real. So right at the beginning, Season 2 has introduced a conflict that you normally find in classic episodes of Star Trek. You know, the episodes where some kind of new being exists at the expense of a recurring character having something happen to him that, like, changes him or fuses him with another major character or something. And this new individual starts developing its own life, its own personality, until somebody finds a way to reverse the process, and then the question becomes, does this new life deserve to exist, or do the original two lives that were potentially lost deserve to be restored? It's a very complex issue, not the sort of thing you would necessarily expect to be covered in Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, I won't say that the series Sonic Prime has gone completely through the whole process of exploring it. They introduced that question at the very beginning, then most of the episodes are just about finding the different shards, and at the end it's brought back. The idea that restoring the original reality would come at the expense of the other realities. So, like I said, they don't quite explore the whole thing in this particular season, But it feels like that's what they're setting up for the third season. And they could really go some interesting places with that, because who's actually going to decide? I mean, ultimately it is going to come down to Sonic, I'm sure. I have no doubt that the status quo will be restored. It's not really a question of if, it's a question of how. But will he do it at the expense of these other realities? Will the different characters from these other realities support the idea of restoring the status quo or oppose it? And who will choose which side? Or will they all oppose it? I mean, they're really setting up for something that could be very complex in its third season. The question is whether or not it will go there. I'm familiar with the Sonic franchise beyond the games, of course, and even in the games a little bit. I know that Sonic can go in that direction. Will Prime, though? That remains to be seen. Beyond that, again, overall it's a pretty good season. It's short, of course, that's how I was able to get through it all so quickly. And unlike other recent Netflix animated works I've watched recently, it didn't feel like a drag, certainly. But I think there's still a lot of untapped potential here. The potential they have realized at this point has been really good. It's still not perfect, it's still got a couple of issues here and there, but it's proving to be a very interesting take on the premise, not to mention a very good multiverse story. In fact, it might be one of the better examples of a multiverse story. Part of what sets it apart from other multiverse stories is that it sets up some very specific rules. You may have heard many people say that the problem with the MCU, for example, introducing its multiverse the way it did, is that it removes the stakes. With an infinite number of realities out there, character deaths, it is argued, don't matter anymore, because if a character dies in the main timeline, well, there's another timeline where he didn't die, so if we really need him or her, we can just pluck that character out and put it in the current timeline. There you go, problem solved. There's no possible way you can ever mourn the loss of that character anymore, because there's literally an infinite number of them out there. But with Sonic Prime, the Shatterverse is shown to actually be quite limited. There are crystal shards floating all throughout the void, but only 5 of them, it is confirmed in this season, have any sort of reality to them. Only 5 of them actually formed new worlds. The rest are just pieces, just floating around. That means there's only so many alternate versions of these characters, and not every alternate universe has the same roster of characters every time. They definitely don't have the same dynamics between those characters. And you get the sense that sometimes they'll get along if they meet each other, and sometimes they won't. So already we have the sense of there are still stakes, because even with multiple versions of certain characters, there's still a finite number of them. And the original characters, the ones that the fans would really care about and want to see restored, are gone unless those other realities vanish as well. That keeps the story focused and allows it to still have stakes. Not to mention, also, there's that aforementioned black pit of nothingness, where potentially any character could fall into if they're not careful. Maybe even an entire universe could fall into it. So that could be a potential hazard, certainly. They don't really make use of that void too much in this season, just for like one particular scene. But I have a feeling they're going to bring it back in Season 3 anyway. So bottom line, Season 2 of Sonic Prime is a good extension of Season 1. Action gets a little repetitive at times, but it still made some improvements. There are some interesting plot twists, and yeah, I think it's worth checking out again. Well, onward to Season 3, although depending on when that was written, who knows when it's actually going to see the light of day, because, you know, stuff is happening in Hollywood right now. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video. But for now, yeah, check out Season 2 of Sonic Prime. Be prepared for a cliffhanger again, but I've heard it's supposed to last 3 seasons, so I'm sure we'll get a conclusion next time. Only time will tell. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. If you want to see us keep doing what we're doing, you might consider doing all the usual YouTube things, as well as hopping down to the description to find links to DeviantArt, Patreon, Twitter, and links for the different books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Your support is naturally appreciated. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.